Yes, you read that right. Today, we're talking about jiggle physics in Genshin Impact and Wuthering Waves. While the modern generation of gacha games has brought AAA expectations to the game part of the equation, there's still at least a little bit more fanservice at play for many of the characters than you typically see in mainstream games. This isn't new, and it's not necessarily a problem. After all, for anyone who finds it distasteful, there are so many other games out there to play. And yet, there is an interesting discussion to be had here. Why, exactly, do even people who will happily play these games still sometimes find their jiggle physics to be just a little jarring? Of course, the first question many people ask when this kind of discussion comes up is, why do you care? Fans get defensive because they're used to people attacking the things that they enjoy, and they want to retain their agency and their right to enjoy those things. Some people just like anime boobs, and does it really hurt anyone if they do? Some will answer from an academic perspective. They have valid concerns about objectification, desensitization, addiction, exploitation, reinforcement of gender stereotypes, impact on younger audiences, and so on. But it's also important to take into account things like the value of escapism, individual responsibility, artistic expression, and creative freedom, the benefits of promoting media literacy rather than starting down the road of censorship, and so much more. Those are important discussions to have, and perhaps if I find the time to really dig into it, I might make a longer video covering all the different perspectives on the subject. For now, I'd like to put those sociological concerns aside and take a more pragmatic look from the perspective of someone who enjoys these games for what they are, and yet still ends up skipping characters on occasion because of this. And it should, of course, go without saying that this is not about painting either game as better than the other. This is an exploration of why animations matter and how the different approaches affect people in different ways. Spoiler alert, it's not the jiggle that's the problem, it's the physics. It all comes down to immersion. The moment a game pulls you in and makes you forget that you're staring at pixels on a screen, everything becomes more meaningful. Every cutscene, every mechanic, every little interaction. That's true whether the game is photorealistic like Red Dead or stylized like Okami. Even abstract games like Tetris can get you in the zone. 3D action RPGs rely on countless systems to build up their illusion, and the goal is to create an experience which lets the player transcend into a different world for a time. One aspect which can make or break that illusion is secondary animation, those subtle details which happen after a primary movement is complete. When a character takes a step and their clothing slowly settles into place, it sells the idea of soft and flowing fabric. When their hair sways gently in the breeze, or trinkets swing with every move, it all looks more authentic. Even better when there's contrast too, like armor plating which shifts without deforming, especially when all of this is coupled with subtle sound effects as well. It lends things weight, emphasizes what materials each part is made of, and helps it all feel real, even if the world includes magic or superpowers or anime-style combat. I'm the kind of person who really appreciates the little details, especially when they capture your attention. Take something as insignificant as leaves flowing in the wind. One of the details which made me fall in love with Ghost of Tsushima was in that training scene early on where young Jin Sakai spars with his uncle. It's set in autumn and the arena is littered with gorgeous fallen leaves. Every step you take disturbs them just a little, and more extravagant moves send flurries flying through the air. The scene would have been beautiful even if the ones on the floor had been fixed in place and the ones in the air had been just static animation, but the way they responded to the characters made each action feel more real. Kuro added this exact detail to a couple of the areas in Septimond, and spotting it absolutely made my day. The same goes for other tiny details: footprints left in the sand or snow, water which is displaced when you wade through it, hair and clothes which have their own inertia. If even just a few of these are done really well, they can make the whole experience feel much more immersive, even if that attention to detail isn't applied to everything. And it's just as important in a stylized game as it is in one which aims for realism. But while these kinds of systems can be crucial for immersion when done right, if the system exists but looks wrong somehow, then it can break immersion. In contrast to my last example, one detail of Ghost of Tsushima which really bothered me was the horse anatomy, which was just flat out incorrect in many animations. Horses are one of those things where a janky animation will probably look just fine to someone who isn't familiar with how their anatomy works, but which can be painful to look at for anyone who is. Some games get it so so spot on that I could happily spend hours just playing with their horses. Red Dead Redemption 2 in particular is just magnificent and has a staggering level of detail. In Tsushima, I ended up walking everywhere because the horse's movements looked so ridiculous, unnatural, and uncomfortable, it was constantly distracting me and stopping me from enjoying the game. When you see a flaw like this, it can be hard to look away, and it's a reminder that everything you're looking at is just a simulation. Before we get into the details, I feel like it's worth a closer look at one more example. For many, it can be really hard to grasp why someone might say an animation feels uncomfortable when you haven't experienced it for yourself. So, let's talk about Pompoko. Pompoko is a Studio Ghibli film directed by Isao Takahata about the clash between nature and the modern world. It follows a community of magical shape-shifting tanuki who live in a small forest on the outskirts of Tokyo as they fight to prevent their home from being destroyed by urban development. It is a very weird film, yet somehow compelling. But how is it relevant to boob physics in a video game? Well, these are magical, shape-shifting tanuki, and the male tanuki have a particular habit of focusing their power to shape-shift their testicles. One of my most vivid memories of the film is of an old master being introduced to a crowd of tanuki, who then reveals that the carpet they've all been standing on is actually his balls. There's even a battle scene where they launch themselves into the sky, contort them around to use as parachutes, then flip them around and enlarge them to use as gigantic boulders as they land on the armored police, and then proceed to wield them as weapons. I have been informed that to most guys there is something fundamentally uncomfortable about watching this. If you feel even an ounce of sympathy, despite how ridiculous it all is, there's something in the back of your mind imagining what all of that feels like and relating it to your own experience. Obviously, the games we're talking about do not go that far. We don't have characters whose attack animations involve their boobs expanding, followed by her spinning around in circles like a helicopter blade, or at least we don't have that yet. All jokes aside, the jiggle physics in both of these games is interesting to compare. Genshin's is less blatant, but still has its flaws, but to someone who has boobs of their own, the physics in Wuwa in particular feel just a little bit like Pompoko. On some specific Wuwa characters, their movement looks and feels unnatural as they flap around as if they're in a hurricane even at the slightest movement, and it looks uncomfortable in the same way that all these testicle shenanigans do. And worse, they fall into the uncanny valley where something we're familiar with is depicted in a slightly inaccurate way, and it feels far more jarring than it would if it was completely off the charts. But where it gets more interesting is that not all characters have this issue, and it's pretty random which characters avoid the problem. It would be natural to assume they just do this based on size, and the larger they are, the more they move. But then you have characters like Sanhua who completely avoids this problem, while some, like Camellia, look just as odd when moving. It's fascinating to look through the characters in your roster and see such contrast between those who just look normal and the ones whose chest seems to have an artificial gravity of its own. Normally, for each new character, I can just shrug and live with it for a little while until I stop noticing it at all, but there have been two characters where I was on the fence about pulling for them, and this aspect of their design made a difference, though to be fair, it was a minor one. Cantarella is the character who most looks like she's wearing water balloons on her chest, which most strongly evokes the Pompoko experience for me. After seeing her design, I kinda went in expecting her to be uninteresting Guna bait, but as a character, she was absolutely phenomenal. Her role in the story, her history, her voice acting, her depth of characterization, even though the quest treated her as a side character and focused on my favorite character in the game, Cantarella still managed to stand out and make me care. And everything else about her design is quite beautiful, especially her long flowing dress with its gorgeous color scheme. I think her outfit would have looked more elegant with a little more fabric around the chest and less busy with her hair in an elegant updo, but like I said before, this is an anime game and many people love her design. I was tempted to pull after finishing the quest, but I was low on funds and I needed Cartafia. And every time I saw Cantarella's boobs undulating in their own phantom wind, it made it just a little easier to skip. But the weirdest one was actually Lupa. I'm not particularly a fan of her design in general, but that's mostly due to the color scheme and the hairstyle outfit combo, which don't work for me. Aside of course from the physics issue we'll get to in a second. And once again, I loved her in the story. Her voice acting in particular is fantastic and really sold her personality as a fierce and feisty warrior with an unquenchable zest for life. Even better, she's the game's first polearm user and she feels so much fun in combat. Again, I was low on funds and sorely tempted to pull. but her design is one which actually led to this discussion on my streams in the first place. You see, most of the other characters who have the out there jiggle physics are wearing normal clothes. They wear fabric which does move at least a little, and in all those cases it's just a slight unnatural movement which can sometimes look a little off. That's why it usually fades into the background once you've seen the character a few times in-game. But Lupa wears armor, metal armor with visible depth. The armor jiggles. This makes it feel like the materials don't exist and have no substance to them. I love it when clothes are made from different things, which have a visible and realistic effect on these kinds of details. When done right, it's exactly the kind of thing which builds immersion. Sadly, Lupa's jiggle physics just make her armor look like it's body paint. This is one of those things which I just can't unsee, and can't stop myself from staring at whenever it's on screen. It completely breaks immersion. I still love Lupa as a character, but this tipped me into skip instead of pull. Augusta and Iuno showcase the two sides of this coin. They both have nice designs, and so far they seem like interesting people, and their introductions in the story gave them gravitas and intrigue, though I'm still catching up on the quests released in their debut patch, so I haven't finished their part in the story. The jiggle physics, in Iuno's case, make more sense than they do for pretty much any other character in the game. She's basically wearing a bikini with some extra fabric, so while the animation is still a little unnatural, at least it doesn't break immersion. Augusta, on the other hand, wears a solid metal breastplate. From what I've seen so far, the jiggle here isn't quite as jarring as it was on Lupa, because Augusta's armor is much more extensive and provides less contrast to emphasize the movement. But the movement is still there and distracts from her truly iconic design. Maybe they have some lore explanation. Maybe their armor is nanotechnology designed to allow for freedom of movement while still providing protection. Even if it was, it still looks like a solid chunk of metal which is somehow jiggling like jelly. Another related detail which often comes up for discussion is the character's proportions. For some people, the characters like Cantarella or Genshin's Lauma, who are particularly well endowed, might cause some sympathetic discomfort because if they were real, they would likely have horrific back pain, especially since their clothes don't look like they'd provide all that much support. However, this aspect has never bothered me. I think I'm just so used to watching animations whose characters have very stylized shapes. A character's shape design expresses their personality through their visual appearance alone. Just look how far from realism some of the designs in films like The Incredibles stray. Even the ones closest to realism tend to design their characters with large heads and huge eyes, and they're far from realistic if you actually pay attention. When you're used to this, your brain ends up just filtering it out. It's fascinating how some aspect of a character's design will bother some people, while for others their subconscious just reads it as a stylistic interpretation which doesn't need to follow the rules which it arbitrarily decides to apply elsewhere. While the jiggle physics in Wuwa are sometimes far more in your face and therefore get much more attention, it's worth highlighting that Genshin does this too. For most of their designs, it's similar to those Wuwa characters whose movement is more subtle, so again, it rarely enters the realm of conscious thought for me. However, both Ayaka and Noelle are in the same situation as Lupa and Augusta. They wear armor on their chest which looks like it should be made of solid metal, and yet they still have noticeable jiggle physics which warps their clothing. Similar to Augusta, their armor is much more covering, so it's not as eye-catching as it was for Lupa, but this is something which has always felt a little off about their models for me. On the other hand, I'd also like to give a tiny bit of praise to what they did for Varesa when it comes to this kind of detail. As I said in a couple of previous videos, nothing about her aesthetics fits the game. I like her despite her feeling out of place, and she kinda feels like a badly integrated crossover character from some other world to me. But while running around with her, I noticed something Hoyo added to her unique, slightly larger model. Her thighs have jiggle physics. The movement is subtle, but it makes her feel more realistic since it echoes how thighs actually move. Most of the time, it's not something you'd notice consciously, but subconsciously, it really helps her feel a little more grounded in the world. And at the end of the day, that's what really matters. I also feel like it's very important to highlight one specific detail about Escoffier's design. I've mentioned in a previous video that I'm not a fan of her aesthetics, even though I generally like the design style of all the other Fontaine characters. But that's actually not really what I'd like to point out here. What I'd like to bring to your attention is something that my Twitch chat pointed out: the rather suspicious placement of her top buttons. Now you won't be able to unsee it either. And And since it's kinda related, let's also quickly talk about the emotional side of fanservice. Another topic which is sadly seen as off limits because of how passionate people are about it. Many get emotionally attached to these characters, and so it's understandable that the devs sprinkle in some hints of romance into their interactions with their main character. But at the same time, many feel that Wuwa in particular does this far too often and that it lessens the emotion of each interaction as a result. Personally, I enjoy a good love story in any media, and the key is just writing and execution. You can have flirting in games without it coming across as forced, though of course everyone has different ideas on what feels natural, and some would prefer it to be left out altogether. In Wuwa, so far, it's gone both ways. With Cantarella, for example, her interactions felt natural to me, while that scene with Lupa at the end of Septimon felt like the suggestive angle kinda clashed with the heavy conversation they were having at the moment. And while they do have their lore explanation for why all the characters seem to feel this way towards the rover, it does get a little stale. What I wish they do is add 2 alternate paths of interaction for each character. Towards the start of the conversation, there could be a choice. For example, maybe you're sat next to them and you choose whether to nudge them playfully or not. If you choose an interaction which signals that you want romantic tension, then that's the path you take. If you don't, you get a more platonic friendship instead. That would keep everyone happy. The people who don't want even hints of romance at all would be able to avoid it. Those who don't mind but feel it's getting a little bit repetitive could get to choose variety, and ones who love a specific character would be able to focus on just their waifu or husbando and treat the rest as friends, and people who enjoy it as it is right now would still have the same experience. It would be extra work for the devs to add 2 parts for each, but I think the effort would be worth it. Both of these games have so many characters, and they often have great personalities, interesting interactions, and intriguing lore. As someone who doesn't want to swipe if I can help it, it can be really hard to decide where to spend your hard-earned pulls. If anything, I'm kinda glad when they have these awkward jiggle physics which turn me away from some otherwise good designs. If they didn't, I would have been in trouble. It's not a problem with revealing clothes. It's not about unrealistic proportions. It's not even about things like Yinlin or Camellia's burst animations. It's not the jiggle, it's the physics. Until next time.